Ladies and gentlemen, some historians are met with scholarly disagreement. Others are met with something far more telling, a concerted wish that they simply should not be heard. Raymond Ibrahim belongs to the latter category, and that is why we are gathered here today. The Sappho Prize is not a popularity award. It is not an endorsement of consensus, nor is it given to those who say what is expected, what is comfortable, or what is safe. The Sappho Prize is an honor. It recognizes courage, and it serves as an encouragement to stand firm. Each year, it is awarded to a person who has shown fearlessness and an uncompromising commitment in defense of free expression. Today, we present the prize for the 20th time. Over the past 2 decades, the Free Press Society has had the privilege of honoring a remarkable line of thinkers and defenders of free speech. Individuals whose voices have shaped public debate far beyond their own countries. Among them are Sir Roger Scruton, Douglas Murray, Dennis Prager, Daniel Pipes, and Tommy Robinson. Voices who each in their own way have demonstrated intellectual courage and a refusal to bow to pressure. Today, Raymond Ibrahim takes his place in that distinguished company. For more than 2 decades, Raymond Ibrahim has devoted his work to one of the most sensitive and systematically underreported issues of our time, the persecution of Christians in large part of the Muslim world, and the historical roots of conflicts that many in the West prefer to explain away as social tensions or the aftershocks of colonialism. His argument is simple, and for that very reason, controversial. Religion matters. Texts matter. History matters. And violence does not become any less real simply because it is inconvenient. At a time when human rights otherwise play a central role in the West's understanding of itself, it is striking how little attention is given to the plight of Christians in public debate. Today, Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world. Yet their situation is often treated as a marginal issue, something that may be politely acknowledged, but rarely examined with the seriousness and consistency it demands. Raymond Ibrahim has made it his task to document this reality. Through his monthly reports, he has carefully gathered and presented well-documented cases of violence, discrimination, forced conversion, blasphemy prosecutions, and the destruction of churches and Christian property. The picture that emerges is not one of isolated incidents, but of structural and persistent persecution. At the same time, another picture comes into view, a striking reluctance in parts of the West to confront these facts openly. Raymond Ibrahim has not limited himself to describing the present. In his historical works, he has sought to place contemporary conflicts within a broader and longer perspective. Here, he explains the historical and theological background to both the medieval and the present-day conflicts between Islam and Christendom. He brings into focus elements of that background which are often overlooked or consciously downplayed by many Western academic historians. For instance, through a reductionist view of the medieval struggle between Islam and Christendom, a view that focuses narrowly on the consequences of Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade in 1095, while overlooking the long history of Islamic expansion and the persecution of Eastern Christians that preceded it. Ibrahim does not overlook this long history. He works with primary sources, he reads classical Arabic texts, he analyzes the ideological foundations of jihadist movements. He insists that we cannot understand reality if we decide in advance what may and may not be investigated. For precisely that reason, he has faced attempts to silence him. Lectures have been cancelled, accusations have been deployed as weapons. Institutions that ought to have defended academic freedom have at times failed to do so. Yet Raymond Ibrahim has stood firm. And it is precisely this steadfastness that the Sappho Prize seeks to honour. The history of free speech is not a history of comfort. It is a history of resistance. It is shaped by individuals who refuse to be told what they may think, what they may examine, and what they may say. It is also shaped by truths that at first seem too difficult to voice, but later prove to be indispensable. When millions of people living under theocratic regimes today call out for freedom and rise up against religious oppression, we are reminded that religion is not only a matter of identity. It can also be a matter of power. It can involve coercion, and it can be used to justify violent repression. Raymond Ibrahim has devoted his life to breaking the silence surrounding these realities. He has done so as a historian, as a writer, and as a public intellectual. He has done so with a perseverance that commands respect, even from those who may disagree with his conclusions. The Sappho Prize is not awarded to those who are necessarily right about everything. It is awarded to those who are willing to take the risk of speaking what they believe to be true. It is awarded to those who understand that free expression does not endure by itself, that it depends on voices that refuse to fall silent and on the courage not to be intimidated. Therefore, it is with both pride and gratitude that the Free Press Society today awards the Sappho Prize 2026 to Raymond Ibrahim. Thank you for your resolve, thank you for your endurance, and thank you for reminding us that the struggle for free speech always begins with the willingness to say what others would rather not hear. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Aya, and thank you all for coming. And thank you very much for bestowing such a wonderful award on me. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. I'm happy to hear that my efforts over these more than 2 decades have culminated this way. This is a good thing that I never really expected, actually. And so to see it happen is definitely a sort of validation for what one's been doing. Because as you can imagine, in the theme that we're discussing, when someone goes against the grain so much, he might at one point think he's wrong and, start to succumb. But not me. I continued nonetheless because and I think this will be part of what we'll discuss, is the importance of the truth. Not necessarily what people want to hear or don't want to hear, but what the truth is, because the truth is very important. If the first premise, how logic and philosophy is, you have a first premise and then something has to fit on top of it. If the first premise is inherently false, everything you build on it is going to be ultimately also false, and the whole thing will crumble at one point or other. That's why you need a strong foundation built on truth. Now, for this talk, I'd like to discuss, we can talk about how we got here, we have to know where we came from. So obviously, that's why I've always been very interested in history, and I find it intrinsically interesting, but I also find it very enlightening insofar as trying to understand what's happening in the now, in the today. So that's one of the main reasons I've always gravitated towards and found my answers in history. And in the context of what we're discussing, basically the West in general, Denmark, of course, in particular, and the question of Islam in general, which is, of course, my field. My field, as Aya pointed out, has always been the nexus of Islam and Christendom, historically, past and present, from a doctrinal point of view, historical developments, and so forth. So what I'd like to do is give you a brief recap of the true history, which you may not be acquainted with, especially if you went to all the good public schools. And from there we'll reach to the modern era and various conclusions. And as I do this, one of the things that I've always liked, and one of the things that have always inspired me in my studies, going way back, is whenever I find continuity. Okay, by continuity I mean, or patterns. So when I see certain things that have happened in the past, and I see they're happening in the same way, maybe in a different guise, different superficial veneer, but it's the same essence, I always take note of that and find it fascinating, because it really tells you that what we're talking about, whatever the topic may be, is not some aberration. Because if it's been around for millennia, then it's something we should take seriously. So briefly, the Islam, when we talk about Islam, a lot of people like to talk too much about the actual religion itself and all the problems it has and how horrific it is. And I actually don't do that. My concern is, what does Islam have to say towards me, the infidel? Okay, because as a non-Muslim, a lot of people will attack Islam, say it's draconian and the way they treat it, and they do this and it's barbaric and polygamy and all that. As far as I'm concerned, that's intercivilizational, which means as long as it affects them, that's their own group, they want to live that way, that's one thing. So for me, I've always been interested in ascertaining precisely what it is that actually impacts us, the non-Muslims. And if you look at it, it's really three intertwined doctrines out of all the many doctrines. And I'm not saying the other ones are not bad or problematic. I'm just saying they don't really concern us. The ones, the inherent one that very few people are aware of, is in Arabic, it's called al-wala wal-bara, and this can be translated as loyalty and enmity, or love and hate. Wala means basically loyalty, allegiance, befriending someone, love, and bara means disavowal, renunciation, up to hatred. Okay, and that is an ironclad doctrine in the Quran. Okay, so Muslims are called to have wala, love, loyalty, etc., towards fellow Muslims. And they're called by Allah to have hate, enmity, disavowal of all non-Muslims. This is an ironclad doctrine. And one of the key verses is Quran 60, verse 4, or Surah 60, Aia 4, where it talks about, it says, you have an excellent example in Ibrahim, not me, the Prophet Abraham, who they call Ibrahim, because as you know, Islam appropriates biblical characters and gives them different roles. So Ibrahim in the Quran is the biblical Genesis Abraham. And as we know in that story, Abraham basically leaves the land that God calls him out of and calls him to another land. And that's all we know about it. But in the Islamic Quranic rendering, before he leaves, he tells his former kinsmen, hatred and enmity will forever reign between us until you believe in Allah alone. Okay? And that is the cornerstone of this particular doctrine, that the non-Muslim must have hatred for the Muslim must have hatred for the non-Muslim, okay? And as I said, the corollary or the other aspect is he must be loyal and help the Muslim. And this is so ironclad. I've seen so many modern day clerics talking about it, of course, in Arabic. I've translated them. I have a video of one man, an Egyptian cleric, where he sits there and he's teaching. He's well-known sheikh, and he tells all his pupils that because Islam allows Muslim men to marry women from the people of the book, which means Jewish and Christian women. So it allows that. Speaking of, sounds rather tribal, but okay. So it allows that, but he was telling them, yes, you can marry them and you can enjoy them carnally and do whatever, but you have to hate them, because you can't let the hate get extinguished. And he gets into the details, and he says, for example, and these are all these Islamic weird doctrines, but he says, one asks, well, so if I come in the house and she's there, I can't say hi to her? He says, you can say hi if your kids are there, but you mean the hi to them, but it's kind of generic, so she can feel like it's a hi, but you have to have the hatred for it. So this is a real thing. This is in their doctrines. This is not made up. Now, in and of itself, I call that the metaphysical sort of underpinning of all the problems that we have. Now, how does this doctrine manifest itself? If you're taught to hate someone, and you come from a 7th century tribal environment like Muhammad, how does that manifest itself? Well, it manifests in what he called jihad, okay? So now you go and you attack the people that you hate, the infidels, and you do whatever needs doing to them. And so why I think this is important is because some people are aware of jihad, but they think it's just, warfare, but it's guided by hatred. And you can see this in the text when you see what happens to the conquered infidel. It's not just we conquered you or we killed you or we enslaved you. There's a whole ritual of sort of degrading measures that are meted out to the infidel. And this is especially the case with those who are enslaved, which at some point I may talk about. But so that's the doctrine that creates the animus. The animus manifests itself into jihad. And then when the jihad is complete and successful, wherever it is, it conquers a non-Muslim region, then the people who are subjugated are you either become one of us and you get equal rights. If you're a people of the book, we give you the option where you can maintain your religion, but you have to pay extra tribute. It's called jizya. And you have to know your place and you have to feel humbled and subdued. That's actually in the Quran. Quran 9:29 says, fight the people of the book until they pay jizya with willingness and feel themselves utterly subdued. And then the Islamic jurists, of course, they take a verse like that and then they build an entire a doctrine around it. And they find also things from the hadith, which is the sayings and deeds of Muhammad. And his sayings and deeds are such, of course, that it enforces the sort of subjugation thing. For example, Muhammad said, if you come across a Christian or a Jew, the way it's written in Arabic, push them to the side, make them feel uncomfortable, and kind of ostracize them. Okay, you're never supposed to say salam. If you're familiar, Muslims will always say salam alaikum, and the response is alaikum salam. You're never supposed to say that to a non-Muslim. Okay, so again, you can see it's not just that there's warfare, it's that hatred is there, and it culminates once that person has been subjugated. And that, of course, is the history of what has happened to much of the non-Muslim world, especially the Christian world. So that basically those are only the three topics doctrinally that I really think you need to know about. And what really made them powerful, if you think about it, is Muhammad, his genius, as I call it, is he took the tribal mores of his 7th century, essentially Bedouin style, which was immensely tribalistic. And as you know, tribalism is basically us versus them. Us being the blood kin, everyone outside the tribe is enemy. We kill them, plunder them, enslave them, whatever. He took that and he now deified it. He re-articulated it through a theological paradigm. So now it's no longer us, our blood, against the others. It's us, the ummah, which means the Muslims collectively, against everyone else. So it was the same logic, but just a slight paradigm shift. And so this is why it's really interesting historically. All the people who converted to Islam were originally tribal peoples, not sedentary people. So you had the Arabs were the first, then the Berbers later on, and then you had the who became the Moors in Spain. Then you had the Turks, you had the Tatars or the Mongols who did become Islamic. And I believe that's because the message of Islam, as I'm explaining it to you, just completely comported with their pre-existing way of life, which is we raid on the other, and we take their stuff, and we enslave them, and we kill them. But now, we do that, and the more we kill, and possibly if we are killed, then we even get rewarded in heaven. So it's even better than secular tribalism. Now, this is deified tribalism, which means now the more you do this, and the more you hate on these people, and you plunder them, and kill them, and destroy them, that's a sign of piety. And Muhammad tells his followers that, there's in the Quran, there's one verse, I believe 9:111, it says, he who fights and kills and is killed gets the highest level of martyrdom in paradise, which includes supernatural, bosomed, very supernatural women who are kind of almost pornographically described in the Quran as pleasuring his favorites in perpetuity. And there's all sorts of weird things like, their hymen comes back and you can continue doing it forever and the erection never softens. And that's actually in the Islamic text, believe it or not. So that's, so there it is. Okay. You now understand that the doctrine itself is not so strange. It's really tribal worldview, but it's just been given a theological veneer and which made it more potent. Okay. That's all I want to say about the doctrine. We can talk some more at another point, but now I'd like to get into a quick recap of the history I often think the history is much more important, because if you talk about doctrine, as you know, a lot of people will complain and say, well, so what? You know, the Bible has verses that are violent, or, you know, you get that. So I always say, fine, let's put the books away now and let's see what happened really in history. Did the Muslims do this? Did they actually uphold what we're talking about as far as what's written in the Quran and codified in what's called Sharia law? Or is this just Islamophobia on our part? So a quick recap of the history is in order, and basically, long story short, Muhammad dies in 632 AD, and that's when the jihad blows up out of Arabia, and quickly the two superpowers of the time, which was the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, and the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Empire, they were the two superpowers. Islam overran and essentially conquered both of them. It didn't conquer the capital of the Roman Empire, but it conquered its many lands in the Middle East. So it conquered Greater Syria, which actually encompassed the entire Middle East, so all of the modern day states you can think of, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestinian territories, even portions of Iraq, all of that was primarily Christian. All that was conquered, Syria, of course, and then Egypt, again, one of the oldest Christian nations, all the way westward, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and then into Spain, okay? And Spain got conquered. And I give you the date 632 because it's very easy to remember. That's the day Muhammad, the year he died. 1 century after his death is 732, and that's the famous Battle of Tours, right in the middle of France. So in 1 century, Muslims living up to what I described to you, the concept of jihad, went and conquered all that vast territory. And most people don't realize all that territory, when you went back that time in the 7th century, and if you looked at the old world, Europe and the North and the Middle East and so forth, the Christian world, most of it was in those territories. So the older Christian territories, where you had the more learned fathers and church fathers, where all the councils were being held, it was all in that area. There were 5 major sees historically. One was Rome, and the other 4 were in the east: Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem. All 4 of those were swallowed up. So in a way, that's, if we say there's 5 and 4 got swallowed up, that's almost saying like 80% of the Christian world was conquered through violent force from jihad. But they never taught you that in your schools. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the Mediterranean, of course, people forget this part, but the Mediterranean was completely devastated. Every single island was conquered, occupied, enslaved. There's very horrific things that I recall reading about what happened to the islands during these early times, to the point that Ibn Khaldun, a well-known Muslim philosopher, he characterized the Mediterranean as it became a Muslim lake. Well, it wasn't a Muslim lake historically. Actually, it was where the North Europe and North Africa and the Middle East were actually all part of Christendom, one world. And that's why Rome had commerce with Egypt and with Syria and vice versa, because they were all Christian at this point in the 7th century. But once that happened, basically Europe, not even all of it, because as we saw, Spain was conquered, but the rest of Europe was basically cut off. And this is when historians used to call the Dark Ages. Okay, so they try to pin the Dark Ages on you. They say the Vikings came and ruined everything around 800. But actually, it was more the Muslims, what they did. And there's an entire thesis by another historian who, of course, got shut up, but this is an early 19th century historian, Henry P. Rin. I believe he was French, but he wrote a whole book called Charlemagne and Muhammad. And he basically said, without Muhammad, the rise of Charlemagne and the feudal system and all that would have been inconceivable, because it was Muhammad and his followers who completely remade the old world and split off Europe from what it was once connected to, which is to say the East, Constantinople as well. So that was a very traumatic event that occurred in the Christian world, and like I said, led to the beginning of the Dark Ages, which, and then, you can look wherever you look. Spain, for example, that's to me a microcosm of jihad versus crusade for centuries. Okay, they try to tell you Spain was some sort of multicultural heaven. Yeah, we'll get into that. But actually, it was, if you look at it, so when the Muslims conquered it, right before they got to Tours, there was if you envision the Iberian Peninsula, In the northwest quadrant, this is the area where it's just rough mountains, kind of a wilderness. Nobody really wants to live there, supposedly, back then. And something like a handful of Christians were holed up there that did not submit to Islam, the way the others had. And the Muslims in their text say, who cares? They're just a bunch of, yokels living in the woods. What are they going to do? And then, anyway, century after century, they started to get stronger and come down and down, further south. And this is, of course, called the Reconquista. Now, to their mind, they were essentially, this was a proto-crusade. They were reclaiming Christian lands that had been conquered by Islam very violently. And that went on. And I just find, and here's the amazing thing, this goes on for literally like 7 centuries until it's finally around 1492, 1500. The war with Islam is finally at an end. And it's all a lot of vicissitudes and a lot of atrocities. A lot of jihadist organizations would come from North Africa. One battle is the Battle of Sagraha in the 12th century. They built a mountain of Christian heads and climbed atop it, singing praises to Allah. And that sort of thing was not as aberrant as you would think. So that's Spain for you. But they'll tell you, but what about the Golden Age? What about, everyone lived in peace? So let me explain to you real quick, I think this is important, what the Golden Age was, and I'll give you an analogy. The Golden Age for Spain, and also the Abbasid Caliphate, because centered around Baghdad, because that also is called the Golden Age. But the best way to understand it is like this. The reason historians will tell you it was a Golden Age, because they look at Spain and they see it had a lot of material wealth, and it was prosperous, and it was culturally refined, possibly, and they had better science, obviously, than Dark Age Europe, because they're the ones who cut off the access to science, obviously. But the Islamic, everything that I just told you, the atrocities, that was still there, 100%. So the best way to understand this is, imagine, these, what is it, UAE or Dubai, that they have those beautiful skyscrapers, right, those countries. Imagine, it's 100, 200 years from now, the whole world's changed. We don't know anything about what really happened. And you look at those countries and you say, but look, we know one thing about that country, UAE or those areas. They had a lot of great architecture, okay, and they were Muslim. Therefore, based on that simple logic, Islam leads to wonderful progress. But we know, we can look at it, yeah, they do have that progress, or they have those things, the buildings and the technology, but one, it wasn't made by them at all, and two, they still are following a 7th century Bedouin mentality within amongst each other. So I submit to you, that's how you should understand the so-called Golden Age in Spain. It was the same thing. They had wealth, almost all of it plundered from Europeans. They had slaves, almost all of whom were plundered from Europe. And they were powerful and opulent, okay? But beneath that, it wasn't because they created anything. It was because they were taking it. But beneath that, it was the same usual Islamic stuff. So as one example, and historians don't like it when I bring this up, but apparently at the height of the Golden Age that they reference, because it was very, very short-lived, it's something around in the mid-7th century maybe, like through 2-3 decades. Well, during that same time, there's what's called the Martyrs of Cordoba. And who these are, they were about 50 Christians, because Christians were subjugated by the Muslims at the time. These aren't the ones who were rebelled. These are the ones who were living under Islam. And because the way Muslims were treating them, and remember what I told you about subjugating, making them feel humiliated, etc., these Christians just kind of couldn't take it anymore, became so frustrated, and just started speaking up very vocally. They deserve the Sappho Prize, actually. They started saying, your prophet is a demon, there's only one Lord, Jesus Christ, this and that. And all 50 of them were tortured, skinned alive. One woman was boiled alive, beheaded, and crucified, okay? This is during the Golden Age. So the Golden Age is much more about material opulence, which, yeah, Muslims would like to acquire, and they can, and much less about a somehow progressive civilization, okay? It never changed, and that's why I think that analogy with these rich Gulf states makes sense, okay? Yeah, they have good stuff, but it's not because of their civilization, and their own culture is still like what it always is. Okay. Now, moving along, we're talking about this vast conquest. So basically, 2/3 of Christendom was conquered in 1 century, right? The Mediterranean was destroyed. It was a traumatic experience for Europe. Spain, I told you, was engulfed in a war. And then later on, you get the Turks. Now the Turks rise up, they become Muslims, and they essentially became the standard bearers of jihad, better than the Arabs, actually. A lot of historians will tell you that they took to jihad even more fanatically. And I'm thinking now of the Seljuk Turks, especially. These are the ones who come right before the First Crusade. They're running amok. They're attacking. You may have heard of the Armenian genocide at the hand of Turks. It actually goes back 1,000 years before the one you know. The one you know is in what, World War I and late 1800s. It actually starts in around 1050. And that's when the Turks start entering in what, Greater Armenia. And according to contemporary sources, they burned thousands of churches, slaughtered countless people, enslaved even more. And again, all throughout this, keep in mind, if you dig in the sources, you will see that the religious hostility that I tried to express to you was always there. It wasn't just one group conquer another. So, for example, out of nowhere, after they conquer something, then they go and break the cross and drag it in the dirt. So obviously, there's an ideological element to it, just like when ISIS does that today. And so this is also why the Ottomans, they overrun basically Asia Minor, which now it's called Turkey. Of course, it was one of the oldest Christian regions in the world. It figures prominently in the book of Revelation. Paul wrote letters to it. And now, of course, it's a bastion of Islam. It's Turkey. And then from there, of course, it gets worse, and they come finally into Europe. Constantinople is sacked in 1453. Very horrific stuff, what happens at that point, and a lot of symbolic imagery, again, degrading the Christian faith and upholding Islam very much. And, all the Balkans, the wars, of course. What happened to these various nations? Hungary fought back for a while, but it too was under the Ottoman yoke for 150 years, and all the other nations south of it in the Balkans. And of course, I believe that's one of the reasons that the Eastern and Central European nations are less fuzzy towards Muslims than you are. They have that sort of recent memory history. In fact, that's what they say. People like Viktor Orban literally say, we don't want Muslims among us. We know what it's like. We've lived with them for 150 years. So I think that I really believe, because what I'm talking about now is much closer to our times. These attacks from the Ottomans were happening in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, right? Up until 1683. Now you have a massive Ottoman army surrounding Vienna, okay? And it could have gone, and it was always piecemeal. I mean, it was to get one, consolidate it, and to get another. And the goal was always to get Rome, of course, being the central symbolic Christian head of Western Europe. So that goes on, but it's even funny that, and few Americans understand this, even America's very first war as a nation is with Muslims. And not just any Muslims, Muslims who are talking exactly like ISIS would talk. So, and I'm talking about the first Barbary War, which was America's first war after it gained independence from Britain. So basically, all these Muslims who were living in North Africa, Europeans called North Africa Barbary because that's where the barbarians live, because all they did is come and raid and kill and destroy. It's hard to really express to you these things unless you really read the sources. I mean, the people were terrified. This is the problem with history. When someone talks about it, and I just give you numbers, X amount died, X amount, it doesn't really capture the sort of visceral experience that people had when you see people descending on you and, tying you up, taking your wife, your daughter, raping them, enslaving. So that's why that was known as Barbary. That's the land of the barbarians, where we want nothing to do with. So those guys started attacking, and this is funny, it goes back to the jizya, okay? So Britain was actually paying tribute to these Barbary pirates as a way for them to not attack British vessels. They said, instead of fighting them, we're just giving them their money, okay? So it was considered jizya. They took it, and they let them go. Now, when the Barbary pirates got wind that America and Britain had fought, and now America was no longer covered by Britain's jizya, America became free game. And so it started attacking American vessels, enslaving its sailors, doing all sorts of horrific things to them. And then finally, and it just shows you kind of the disconnect that we're going to deal with here, that we're talking about, the modern day disconnect. It goes all the way back to the enlightened thinker, Thomas Jefferson, because he went and he met with the ambassador, one of the ambassadors from Barbary, to try to get to release the enslaved Americans. And then look what he wrote. Then after his meeting, he sent a letter to Congress, dated March 28, 1786. We still have this letter. And here's what Jefferson wrote. Quote, "We took the liberty to make some inquiries concerning the grounds of their, Barbary, pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury, and observed that we considered all mankind as our friends, who had done us no wrong, nor had given us any provocation." So Jefferson started off by saying, look, we've done you no wrong, we like all mankind, can't we just work together? And then he continues, "The ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners or infidels, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Mussulman, meaning Muslim, who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." Okay? Doesn't that sound exactly like something ISIS would say? And here we are, so we started, and by the way, this is the only quote I'm giving you, but in all the battles and in all the confrontations that I spoke about earlier, that was the logic. Whenever the Muslim met with the Christian or whatever to parley, this is how the Muslim would say. He would say, it's our religion, you're the infidel, and it's our right to attack and kill you. That's just the way it is. Now, that long history, we now need to talk about what happened to Christians during this time, okay? They were vastly persecuted. It's not the story that you hear. I mean, the apologetics that I hear nowadays, they say, for example, the only reason that they took jizya from Christians was because the Christians didn't want to serve in the military. So that was their way of contributing to the war effort. There's nothing whatsoever in any Islamic source that says that. Not to mention, a Christian could not join a Muslim army because he's an infidel and he's seen as a fifth column. So I'm just showing you the kind of lies that they'll try to do. Instead of saying the truth, which is, yeah, the jizya was a humiliating tax, they try to worm it and make it sound like, no, it was just, it was trying to be a military exemption for the guy. He didn't want to fight, okay? Not true. Now, the three choices that you may be familiar with, which I alluded to in Quran 929, which says basically fight the infidel until he converts, or he dies, or he pays tribute and he lives as a second-class citizen. That was the constant. That was the norm all throughout the Islamic world. Okay, and we know that because we have texts and charters and tax documents still left, and it shows that. There's some that talk about how when the Christian or the Jew would come and pay tribute, the jizya, he had to come on all fours like an animal as part of the humiliation ritual, or the tax collector would pull his beard and slap him on the head. Okay, so imagine that's the sort of thing, and of course in that climate, churches, there's extreme restrictions on them, even though in theory there shouldn't be, and they get attacked and they get burned. Long story short, it all comes down to the whim of the people. And up until now, you look at these countries, it's funny, I tell you about continuity. I'll read something about in 800 about how one Christian in Egypt did something that upset a Muslim man. Then the Muslim man accused all the Christians of something like blasphemy. Then all the Muslims rise up and attack and burn and kill. And this goes on for 2 weeks. And the authorities look the other way. That happens like here now, almost every other week. All the time. I come across these stories. Okay, so that's what I mean by the continuity. Not much has really changed. Okay, but and guess when the jizya was finally abolished and by whom? The big bad evil white man. During the colonial era, that evil time, when they went there, the European powers, they actually made sure that was abolished, and they tried to bring in a sort of equal type citizen, irrespective of religion. All right, but as far as how Christians during the historic times I was talking about, just to give you again just one simple anecdote that I'll tell you what people say of this guy. So there was a Fatimid Caliph in Egypt, and his name is Hakim Ba'amrullah. A Fatimid Caliph would be a Shia Caliph, actually. Most people don't know Egypt was run by Shias for almost 2-3 centuries, and that Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is a bastion of Sunni learning, was actually created as a Shia madrasa. But anyway, this Caliph, because he was a Shia and the population of Egypt was still primarily Sunni, in order to show his bona fides and make them trust him, he went and destroyed 30,000 churches, and including some synagogues in Egypt. This is at a time, of course, we're talking about the 11th century, So this is at a time when that region is still heavily Christian. It's still not Muslim majority. But the sources that say this are Muslim sources. Now, you know what? So you know how Western historians treat this guy? He's known as the Mad Caliph. Because what he did had no rhyme or reason, no sense. He was just a crazy guy. And please don't think he was representative of your typical caliph. And yeah, to be sure, he did a lot more, but actually the typical caliph also engaged in that sort of thing. Maybe not at that mass scale of 30,000, obviously. There probably weren't many churches left after him, but I'm just showing you the sorts of things that would happen. And the point is, you know, people say, well, okay, Christians and Jews, they had their pact with the Muslims. They're paying tribute, they're feeling subdued, etc. But that's only as good as Muslims want it to be. So anytime, like I said, a Muslim or a group of Muslims just rise up for whatever reason and attack the Christians, that's it. You don't have any rights. You can't go to the authority. The authority either turns a blind eye or maybe even aids. And that happens till this very day. In Egypt, for example, there's an entire criminal network of Islamists who target young girls for abduction, for rape, and they shame them, and and they take videos and they do all sorts of things so they can convert to Islam. And it's well known that the authorities don't do anything, and some of them are working with them. And it makes sense. Why not? Because they think what they're doing is right. They're Muslims. These are infidels. We're helping them out. What's so bad about making them come to see the light of Islam? Okay? So, and then the worst of all, and that's what I mean when we talk about the historical thing, but we're also seeing it in the modern, is the slave raids. So, there was the jihad and there was all that, but it always culminated with massive slave raids. So the Ottomans, I would be reading a primary chronicle, and it would note a date and say the Ottomans came and attacked this or that city, usually in the Balkans, and they left with 60,000 slaves. Or they came here and they left with 20,000 slaves. Or they came here and they just left with 120,000 slaves. And like really big numbers. And it describes women and children naked, shackled, being whipped. And if they can't run far enough, they get killed. So pretty brutal stuff. The Barbary pirates that I was telling you about in North Africa, we know for a fact, because one historian has actually taken the time to collate all the information. And he says there was at least 1.25 million European slaves within just 1 century, between like 1560 and 1660, all Europeans that were brought there and again, very, very horrifically treated. But like I said, the Ottomans, and even more so the Tatars, the Mongols who became Muslim, primarily those associated with the Golden Horde and the Crimea Khanate, those, unfortunately, it's very hard to get the numbers, but when you get the sense that we're talking about many, many millions, okay, of peoples, of the Slavic peoples. They're called that for a reason, okay? Were being enslaved and taken away and just going through essentially hell, okay? And these pirates, just to give you an idea, I mean, if you looked at the map of Europe, as you know it, so I've already shown, if you looked again, 7th century map of Christian world before Islam, first thing you see is 3/4 taken away, and then, Spain taken away. Half of France for a long time, you had, even after the Battle of Tours, you had Muslims ensconced in France. They had a base in Switzerland. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Valais, a small area where they actually had a base, a raiding base. They attacked and almost sacked Rome in around 854, or 850s, roughly around that time. So this was a constant thing. They went as far as Iceland and the Faroe Islands to collect slaves. They had an island named Lundy, it still exists, off the side of Britain, which they used as a base. And they raided Baltimore and Ireland and all these they may have come to Denmark at that point, who knows? There is in fact some writings about that, which I haven't pursued yet. So that was the story of Islam and the West and the Christian West. Now let's fast forward to today. When the great age of deceit fell upon us, and when truth gave way to relativism, and when good became bad and bad became good. That's where we are, okay? This is obviously its own topic, and there's no time for that, but I think we all intuitively sense what I'm talking about. And, just to keep it on the current topic, history now is taught in a way in the West that exists to demonize the Christian West any which way it can, and to exonerate and make Muslims look like the victims. And there's a reason for that. History is not just some dry, useless thing. History is a very powerful weapon the way you use it. or misuse it in this case. And I've coined this fake history. We've all heard of fake news, of course, and fake news does its damage, but it's ephemeral. It comes and it goes. Fake history is a lot more subtle and a lot more dangerous, because what fake history is you create a false narrative. So let's say I say, actually, Christians have been attacking Muslims for centuries and Muslims are innocent. Let's say that's the fake history. I say that. Well, guess what? You're going to see everything today in current events through that lens, and it's going to confirm what you're being told. You're going to be, when they tell you, well, whites are racist, or whites are Islamophobic, or whites are xenophobic, it's going to make sense if you believe the fake history. And the history that is coming out of the academic departments is really fake, okay? It's not grounded in the sources that I've looked at. A lot of these sources I actually collated when I worked at the Library of Congress, so I was really lucky to access a lot of primary materials that completely give the lie to what's being taught today, mainstream academic discourse. And I'll give you just one perfect example. I used to go to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and there was a very famous professor. His name was John Esposito, and very famous. He was the go-to guy, intelligence agencies, because this was around 9/11, 2001, sorry. And he was everywhere. He's written multiple books, all of them praised, and he was the editor of the Oxford History of Islam. That's very prestigious. He has, in one of his books, this line, which I've said so many times because it's so ludicrous, I've essentially memorized it. But he says, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims elapsed before an imperial papal power play led to a series of so-called holy wars that have left an enduring legacy of mistrust and resentment. So what he's saying is from the dawn of Islam until the First Crusade, it was all peaceful coexistence until those evil papal power play, the Crusaders, decided to just, for the heck of it, let's go and ruin everything. Let's ruin all this peace. Nothing about how 3/4 of the Christian world was violently conquered. Nothing about, in 1 year, 30,000 churches being destroyed. Nothing about the millions of Christians being enslaved before the First Crusade. So that's what I mean by very dangerous fake history. But like I said, there's a reason it's being said. If you believe this fake history, that will be the paradigm which you will always see current events in. And it will help support the idea that, the Muslims are victims. It's the Christians, it's the Europeans, it's the white people who are evil, okay? And so now we come to the real final point, which is the elephant in the room known as hate speech. This is essentially, if you don't know what's going on, it's this truth has been labeled hate speech and banned. But that word, hate speech, is just a euphemized weapon to make you shut up and get along with what we're trying to do and stop inconveniencing us with your truths, okay? So now truth has become hate speech. Now we're supposed to be a society that instead of just saying, here's the truth, let's build on the truth, because if you can't build on the truth, then you're not building anything. It's going to sink, it's going to break, okay? Instead of, and the truth can be ugly, I get that. The truth can be uncomfortable. But hiding the truth and rearranging it and whitewashing it and putting a falsehood in its place and then trying to build something atop that, like I said, it's destined to failure. And we've reached the point, and even think of the logic, hate speech. So now truth must take a second seat rather than someone getting offended. What kind of society runs on principle that making sure nobody gets offended is all we're about? I mean, that's a soon-to-die kind of society if that's your ultimate criterion. If it's more important that some individual doesn't get offended, that's more important than getting the truth out. Something's really wrong. And in the context of this wonderful prize I've received, I'll tell you a little bit of my experiences that Aia alluded to show you the sorts of things that I had to go through. My so-called experience with cancel culture. And these terms, it's funny because I was suffering these terms before they had a name. I didn't know what they were called, being canceled and all that. But this actually starts in college. In college, I was lucky. I had, many of you may know, Victor Davis Hanson was my professor in the early years. We're talking about 28, 29 years ago. Great guy. And that's probably why I liked history and wanted to continue with history. And I got my master's degree with him. He was on the chair of my committee and so forth. And then right after it, 2001, 9/11 happened. And he actually was encouraging me, saying, you should get your PhD. long story short, I applied and I got accepted by one of the best schools, which was Georgetown in Washington, D.C. They had a very strong Middle East Islamic studies program. And I went there and I got good grades, but I can tell my professors did not like me. And they would even tell me, and they would argue with me about what I wrote. And one of them actually like flipped out. You know, it's what's called triggering, as I've learned since. Okay, but he did this in like, I don't know, 2004 maybe. And I left a bad taste in my mouth. And at that time, I got a job at the Library of Congress, as I mentioned, and that became a full-time job. And eventually, I got a book deal, and I started gravitating away from happily school. But I also remember going to, also in D.C., Catholic University of America, which is a big Catholic school. I went there just to study Semitic languages as part of my work at the Library of Congress, because I dealt with a lot of Semitic languages. And I remember taking a course with a priest. And when he saw what I wanted to write about, which was conflict between Muslims and Christians, he just got so like, no, why don't we talk about dialogue? And how about we do a dialogue thing? So that didn't last either. I left, okay? And then, so then in 2007, my first book came out, The Al-Qaeda Reader, and that was like a big thing at the time, and I was actually popular. Believe it or not, back then I used to appear on CNN, or Fox News, of course. Even you may not know these, but these are pretty, NPR, which is like the most left-wing radio in America. They used to actually have me come on, but before long, as I pieced it later, I started saying the wrong things, and I started getting less and less calls from these people, okay? And what were the wrong things? Well, I was saying the right thing. I was saying the truth, okay? And I just continued to do that, doing my thing, mostly very low-key, just writing articles, writing books. And then one of my biggest books came out, my more famous book, Sword and Scimitar, came out in 2018. And I was invited by the U.S. Army War College. This is the biggest example. Let me give you a lesser one right before it. Right before it in 2011, I was invited by a college in Seattle, Everett College, to come and give a talk. And so I don't know if you know them, you probably have your own versions here, but Muslim activist groups, we have what's called CARE. What a nice name, huh? CARE. We care. It means Council on American Islamic Relations. And they exist precisely to shut someone like me down. So when they got wind that I had been invited at this college in Seattle, they just mobilized all these Muslims and people protesting, and they very much tried to pressure them to cancel. But this college actually didn't cancel. And when I got there, I didn't even know what was going on. I thought it was going to be a small talk, and I go in and there's cameras and reporters and Muslims waving banners. Anyway, I gave my talk, and it was completely packed. Okay, it's a school, and there were students sitting on the ground because there was nowhere. And all of that, of course, isn't because me. It was because they made so much controversy, CARE, and the talk went through. So obviously, a lot of people want to see what this is all about. Okay, so that's an example of how it backfired. But just to show you the optics and the lies, it was a big thing. Afterwards, MSNBC, I think it's still out on the internet, wrote a whole spread about it, and it's inclined to showing me as the bad guy, okay? And even though this class was, like I told you, it was probably like 5 times your amount. It was a big hall, and it was really full. And it was young, American students who were really interested in asking questions. The 3 pictures it showed, okay, there was one woman in a burqa, pure black, the hefty bag look, sitting there in the back. And there was another Muslim man sitting there. It showed only 3 people, that woman, that Muslim man, and one kind of, I don't know, like a hippie looking dude who probably didn't even care what I was saying. And that was the impression it gave, okay? Like that's what it was. Actually, it was the exact opposite. It was a lot of people who were happy to come and who were learning. But you see, that's one of the ways that the media, that's how they engage in fake news, just by images. But the bigger one was the U.S. Army War College, very prestigious military institution based in Pennsylvania. And after my book, Sword and Scimitar, came out in 2018, they liked it, and they invited me to come give a talk about it. And it was supposed to be sometime in 2019. And then like 2-3 days before I'm supposed to fly out, I get my main contact tells me, hey, we're gonna postpone this for some later time, which we'll figure out. And I'm like, why? And then he tells me CARE and these other leftist organizations started attacking and writing letters to the War College saying, how could you bring this guy in? He's a liar, he's an Islamophobe. et cetera. And then it called them white supremacists, and we feel endangered like this, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the War College buckled but luckily, enough media reported this because it was kind of a scandal, and a lot of people actually got very angry about it. 10 congressmen wrote a letter to Trump about this, calling it a shame for the U.S. Army War College to actually, bow to the whims of CARE is now actually in one state, Texas, an Islamic terrorist group. Okay, so that's the group that's telling the War College what they can hear. All right. And also the National Association of Scholars sent a letter, all these professors signing on my behalf to Trump as well. And so they started getting a lot of pressure at the Army War College. And parents would send me emails saying we've withdrawn our children and not sending tuition. So it became a real scandal. So they started contacting me every day. But I wouldn't answer my phone for some reason because I enjoyed the pressure and I wanted the heat to be on just for a little longer. And then I finally relented. And I went and I gave the talk, and just like before, it was a complete reversal of what these groups wanted. Basically, it blew up in their face, and they even told me, the event organizers, my talk was the second biggest talk the college had given after Buzz Aldrin, who went to the moon. Again, this isn't because of me, it's because this is what happens when they create so much controversy and then they don't get what they want, which is a cancellation, because people want to see, what's this all about, okay? So that's what's going on. This is the situation. I've told you the history and the doctrine. The two things are incompatible, and we come back to a very philosophical and even religious premise, which is truth. The truth must never be abandoned. Truth as you know it, okay? If the first premise is a lie, even if it sounds like a white lie, for example, all cultures are equal, all religions are equal. I mean, that seems to be a taken for granted premise today, isn't it? But it's a lie. And if you believe that and you build a society on that, well, the society will be a lie and it will be destined to failure. And by the way, a final word about culture, because, and especially multiculturalism. I think people need to understand what the word culture means. It doesn't mean food and dress and exotic dress. I think that's the problem. When you think that culture means it's just different people who dress differently, maybe eat differently and have a different language, those are part of different cultures, but those are the exterior, most superficial aspects. The real meaningful aspects of a culture is often rooted in its religion, okay? And I'm not saying this is actual, I've read books that are devoted to culture and they all come back to saying religion is what infuses a culture. Which, by the way, if you lose your religion, you do start losing your culture and you sort of become materialists. Something that I think Western Europe should heed. But what I'm saying is the idea of multiculturalism, the idea that cultures can all live together. Yeah, if it was just about different food and dress, it could. But the reality is the culture, and I'll give you a perfect example. If I look at Europe, let's say Denmark, let's say the Danes, okay? Yeah, I mean, culturally, you probably all eat the same thing, dress the same way, roughly. But there's the extreme right Dane and the extreme left Dane, right? Well, that's part of their culture. Those views of right and wrong, that's the culture. That's the most important part of a culture. These distinct sets of seeing the world and having an entire ethical system. That's why you can come to a country like Denmark, which even, let's say it was racially homogenous, it's all Danes, okay? But there's gonna be a lot of conflict because they don't share the same vision, okay? Just that. And you can go to another country that actually has different races, but they do share the same vision and they're actually better off. So now bringing in Islam, okay? That is a culture that is so antithetical to, let's say, Danish, Western, Christian culture. And I don't mean dress and food. I mean worldview. I've already given you some examples of how they think and they see the world and how they want to treat it, which is, okay, you're the enemy by default. You exist to be plundered, enslaved, and hated, as you will recall that original doctrine. I told you. So the biggest lie I do believe is multiculturalism, because it's relativistic. And it makes you think that what you're really doing is imagine what's better, to have a house of 10 people and they all have the same values and the same beliefs and the same moral system, or to have 3 people who are one way, 3 people the exact opposite, 3 people the exact opposite. And how is that a good thing? People haven't really thought that out. That leads to conflict, obviously, okay? But until you can admit it, and that's what I'm saying, you have to talk about the first premise. In this case, the first premise is that no, cultures are not all equal. Religions are not all equal. You have to actually be honest and objective about them all. And I'll leave you now. You may be religious or not, but I'll leave you with a biblical verse spoken by Jesus Christ, which I think is absolutely true to our current setting and our current situation. And it's basically that the truth shall set you free. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.